Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. This is broadcast number 743, March the 3rd, 1986. There are a few items in the news that I want to run down with you very quickly. I won't elaborate on them, just call attention to what is happening, and then continue with part 5 on the Space Shuttle Challenger, the explosion, and what I thought happened and is coming down in the investigation into the Challenger. Of course, number one item, it's a toss-up between events in the Philippines and around the world, but I think a very serious item to consider is the murder of Prime Minister Olof Palme of Sweden, a very liberal man born from what he described as an aristocratic family. He turned left in terms of considering the poor. He compared Richard Nixon's bombing of Hanoi to Hitler's bombings, and there's an article in the New York Times, March 1st, 1986, but a lot of good articles about his background. He was a decent person who tried to work for the poor, the imbalance of rich and poor, and he was gunned down in Sweden like a dog. Of course, the radical, the left, the German groups are claiming credit for killing him. This is similar to the Italian brigades, the Red Brigades that were formed by Licio Gelli and the P2 agent provocateurs to blame the left for killing a man like this. And the investigators look for the left. It's like the SLA being the left. The SLA is the CIA, and they have wiped out a very important politician, probably the most liberal in the world today. Another article that was in the news this week was Advanced Genetic Sciences, the corporation with tentacles to Germany and to Belgium and Sweden and to the law offices of Sullivan Cromwell, the group that I've been talking about for the last month. They have been spraying evidently a tree or trees, some trees, in the northern part of California without any permission to do it, and now the Environmental Protection Agency has come in and said, we thought that we didn't give you permission to spray these trees, that there's a possibility that insects and birds could carry this living bacteria away, take it from the sap around the injection wounds of the trees. So they're so anxious to put on strawberry plants in Monterey County and see how far it travels that they were caught already doing this in Berkeley, California. Mr. Conrad, Joseph Conrad, the cartoonist, has a picture of the space shuttle and then making appropriately cartoons on this tragic event. February 27th, 1986, in the LA Times. The tip of it is called The Image. Another section is called Pride. The body of it is called Money. Underneath is a schedule pressure. Down below is a little bit of ambition. And on the wings is cost-cutting, and the base is public relations. And the title of the cartoon is Autopsy of a Catastrophe. Another cartoon by a man named Marlette in the Los Angeles Times Sunday section has Uncle Sam holding these skeletons, and he's in a sea of about 40 skeletons, and he has one in his hand, our own United States Uncle Sam, saying, "Alas, poor Ferdinand, I knew him well. Alas, poor baby Doc, I knew him. Alas, poor Shah. Alas, poor Somoza. Alas, poor..." And that cartoon is similar to what I had on the air last week when I was talking about certain political events that are taking place, the election in Portugal, with a socialist being elected there. And I said the next country he will hold up the head and say, "Alas, poor Pinochet," and then "Alas, poor Ronald Reagan," for his close affinity to the Nazi Gestapo network, the Odessa network, through his entire political career since making movies with Errol Flynn in Hollywood. And then we have to go to the head of South Korea and Taiwan and hold up all those skulls, and those are our foreign policy. Almost everyone in the country, I suppose, heard Representative Robert Dornan from California describing Vladimir Posner, the commentator on ABC radio or TV, as being a disloyal, betraying little Jew. Now, I'm wondering if this wasn't a cause and effect, a disinformation or a provocateur kind of operation. William Casey has a large control of ABC, our CIA director, and his capital cities that he formed bought ABC. And I'm wondering if they put Mr. Posner on following Ronald Reagan's speech so that they would have an excuse to identify disloyalty and betraying with Jewishness in this country. Of course, Rabbi Abraham Cooper of the Wiesenthal Center protected Dornan. They said he's not an anti-Semite, that he helped in Germany in 1979 to get rid of the statute of limitations on prosecuting war criminals, but then Cooper and Wiesenthal cover up the lies about Joseph Mengele, and right away the Holocaust Center, Wiesenthal Center, was protecting Dornan. Jean Kirkpatrick, Alexander Haig, Robert Dornan. There's a whole list of people, Jerry Falwell, that are very close to certain Jews and to certain organizations that make them appear that they're not anti-Semitic. But this is the first time that I remember on the floor of the Congress hearing this or anything like it for a long time, because it doesn't matter who they're talking about. When you talk about disloyal, betraying little Jews, the name Posner is long forgotten, and he's put on ABC so that I believe Dornan can come back with the remark. Also, our president is getting pretty nervous with the news media now that they're linking him to the pressure on the space shuttle. And so with his microphone allegedly off, you all know that he referred to them as sons of bitches, just as he had the mic off when he announced he was ready to attack the Soviet Union in 1 minute. He was angry that Mr. Posner could follow his speech, but I believe that right on top of Ronald Reagan's speech, to have a Soviet citizen talking and interviewed, and on the station ABC, it gives a chance to put a lot of ideas into the congressional record and into the news media the people might not be thinking about. Now, this past week, Senator Richard Lugar had gone to the Philippines and helped Marcos ease his way out, and then he swings back with the material. The United States is urged to apply Manila goals in Managua, Nicaragua. Now, Senator Lugar, who wants to attack militarily the country of Nicaragua that America has decimated and controlled for years, is the same Lugar that allegedly worked with Horace Sima, a known Nazi war criminal from Hungary, who lived in Madrid and picked up money from Horace Sima and the Nazi Third and Fourth Reich combined to put in a Swiss bank account for the accounts of Richard Nixon when he was running for president. It's no wonder that Mr. Pullman identified Richard Nixon with behavior like Adolf Hitler when the money comes right out of the till of the probably the Bormann Brotherhood Fund, or to continue the Nazi policies, and the bagman, of course, is Mr. Lugar. Another story in the New York Times this week, U.S. may return some Marcos money. He was printing paper money and took coins, and there's several $1 million in currency that we want him to return to the Philippines. One of the biggest scandals in this country is that 80% of the currency of the United States has gone out of this country and is now in South America and Swiss banks, probably in the hands of the Odessa and the Mormon Brotherhood. So they shuffle these coins around. Marcos takes out a few million. He'll put it back. Our money leaves the country and gets probably siphoned out to dictators and drug dealers all over the world. The excuse for Ronald Reagan and George Shultz to push $100 million for Contra aid was described in the LA Times this week. Reagan was complaining that they have repression in Nicaragua, they have subversion, they have terrorism and drug trafficking. There have been many reports that the drug trafficking come out of Nicaragua is from the Contras themselves buying guns and doing the drug trafficking. And Mr. Banzar, Hugo Banzar, and the pals of Klaus Barbie down in Bolivia, who attended the Republican convention in 1984, were some of the biggest drug dealers in the world, as are Madame Chenault and the Kuomintang, the Chinese mafia, and Reverend Moon with Mr. Ryoshi Sasakawa. The right wing has been involved in drug traffic the last 40, 50 years, and the CIA very much escalated since Vietnam and since the Shah of Iran was in, and opening up these various routes of drug traffic. So Reagan's excuse for a military operation there is that there's drugs, and yet there's an open record of drugs linked to funds put in the bank, the E.F. Hutton Bank, the investment house, the stock brokerage, run by George Bush's brother-in-law, Scott Pierce, and mafia money, pizza, mafia, heroin traffic money in the account of Merrill Lynch, while and during the time that Donald Reagan, the chief of staff of the White House, was the head of Merrill Lynch. So this story of we have to go in because there's drugs is ridiculous. Another very important story this past week was that the judge, U.S. District Judge Julian Cook, Jr., has put off the DeLorean trial 5 months. Now, I don't play too much on rumors on World Watchers, as you know, but I did pick up a story that Ed Meese is interfering with the trial in Detroit, where he's supposed to come up with where this missing 8.9 million was. It's reduced. At one point it was 17 million and 23 million. He took 8.9 million that was supposed to go into Ireland, and that was taken away from the Utah company that he had there. But the money that he took out of Utah and out of the accounts, as I understood it and had on the air for years, was to go to Klaus Barbie to buy cocaine, and the money that Barbie had, he put in Joseph Mengele's account in Sweden, in Zurich, Switzerland rather. So now the judge has delayed 5 more months, and I understand that Edwin Meese, the Attorney General, and Pat Robertson, he's very close with John DeLorean. Pat Robertson is helping DeLorean get off this rap in Detroit, and then look for Pat Robertson to run as vice president under George Bush. I'm going to be writing to the U.S. District Judge in Detroit this week and calling the Justice Department and the FBI to see what I can do as a private citizen to complain. Now, the inquiry has been going on regarding the Air India crash. We are concerned, of course, when 7 astronauts are killed. 329 people were killed on a Boeing 747, a bomb that went off, and they have confirmed by bringing up all the parts that they need to know that there was, in fact, a bomb on that plane that killed those people. There also was a bomb on a plane that was supposed to go to Bombay that left from Vancouver. And the men involved with the bomb on the East Coast allegedly had trained with Franklin Camper at our training camp for hired mercenaries where they teach to blow up airplanes and so forth. Camper has close links, as I've said before, to John Connolly and the Permindex operation, the group that create these assassinations for political purposes, the gang that were supposed to invade Dominica with their Nazi armbands and swastikas and their links to the Aryan nations, to Richard Butler up in Idaho. All of these things connect to violence all over the world, and so planes blow up, prime ministers are killed, and there is still a lot of work to be done to get to find out who does these things. Another item about a political assassination and the consequences afterwards. Egypt is having a big problem now. The New York Times and LA Times, the various papers this week had the story of Egypt's security police chief was ousted. They've had at least 36 deaths that we know of, and the paramilitary police have been very active. President Mubarak was with George Bush just 2 days before Mr. Sadat was murdered, and there were close links of the CIA to the overthrow of Sadat with his peacekeeping with the Israeli government and putting Mr. Mubarak into power. Now, he replaced his former security chief with a Major Badir, B-A-D-R. His name is Zaki Badir, a former internal security officer, and Badir was the one who was the governor of a particular city called Asiyut, a stronghold of Islamic fundamentalism that was very active at the time of the assassination of Anwar Sadat in 1981. So he has moved his former police chief out, and the one in power now worked with him and was active in putting down the fundamentalists when Sadat was murdered, because they had to quell any possibility of opening this up or street riots at the time, and now he's become the head of the Egyptian police. But I'm sure that the Egyptian people will be rumbling, just as those in the Philippines, and one of these days we will see riots there to get rid of Mubarak and his team of assassins. Finally, there is 2 stories, the LA Times and New York Times this week. One for the New York Times about the trial in Rome, an unsettling question at Rome trial. And this is about Sergei Antonov spending 3 years in jail, and the prosecutor has asked for an acquittal because there wasn't any evidence in 3 years that the Bulgarians and Mr. Antonov had a role in planning to shoot the Pope. They're not going to invest the fascist connections. They're going to ignore those, the New York Times says, and Bulgaria wants to try Agca for his links to the right wing, which, of course, the Italian government doesn't intend to do. And then the out that they will use on declaring an acquittal is that Agca is crazy, and this past week, again, he's comparing himself to Jesus and talking about World War III. And what I said when the trial first began, the very first day, that it would open that way and end that way, and if they didn't have any evidence, they could say Agca was crazy, not that the investigators didn't have enough material, which they admit, to convict poor Mr. Antonov and now they're going to acquit those people, let them off, which they should have never even considered the arrest that they did at the time. And then finally, just one more of these stories to update. Ronald Reagan has approved a fund of arms for Saudi Arabia. He put aside a promise of giving weapons to Saudi Arabia just before the Bitburg conference, but he didn't want to connect money to Saudi Arabia to putting wreaths on the Waffen SS graves. So now there's been this little time limit, and it's February and 28th. New York Times, it has a story, 300 million worth of missiles go to Saudi Arabia. And at the time of Bitburg, they were arranging that Great Britain would loan the money, or accept the money rather, from Saudi Arabia for the weapons, but it would really be coming from the United States. Alan Cranston is objecting to this. They say that Saudi Arabia funds the Palestine Liberation Army. They give money to the Syrians. They undercut the United States anti-terrorist policy in the Middle East. They won't support King Hussein of Jordan. They continue to snub Egypt because Egypt had some accords with Israel, which they stabbed behind their back. And again, Reagan is depending on Senator Richard Lugart, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, to smooth over the feelings of the Jews that all of this money is going to Saudi Arabia. They're still violently anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, and this was right on top of the Bitburg, so he gave it a few months to soothe it over. Now to the space shuttle for the remaining of this program and for many, many weeks to come. Just as a quick summary, because of the news that is coming in about the Space Shuttle Challenger, and for those of you who have listened to the past broadcasts that I've done the past 4 weeks, I just want to run through, not everything, of course, of those, just a few key points. I began the Monday after the Challenger went down on Tuesday, and the Monday after that, February the 3rd, I had point number one, that the president was giving his speech scheduled for Tuesday, January 28th, and he needed his teacher, Krista McAuliffe, up there to synchronize with his State of the Union message to Congress. Now, this morning at 5 a.m., I woke up and saw on CNN Mr. Hollings, Senator Ernest Hollings, talking about asking who did the pressure to launch the space shuttle in the cold. And yesterday he was on David Brinkley for a half hour, and he was talking about the same question. All of Washington is talking about it. I got from very good sources that Washington knew, two newspapers in particular, they already know that it was ordered from the White House, and now it is seeping through, and I couldn't put it on my program as a fact that Washington had accepted, but now they're closing in on who made the phone call. I called Senator Hollings' office today, the branch of the Commerce Committee that he's on, and gave them some suggestions about what to do to look for answers to who pressured, and I'll share those with you in 1 minute. So 4 weeks ago, the first point was that the president was having a speech that night, and he had to wait, and why the teacher in space? It was a political gimmick at the time of the 1984 elections. And then the next week, also on that February the 3rd, I was talking about the weather being a factor, and how the liftoff was delayed. It forced the delay, and how Jesse Moore of NASA said on Sunday, we won't be forced. There's a schedule pressure, but nobody can pressure us. And the delays of the sandstorm and the wind, and then the low temperature that would be a problem, which they said, and how Rockwell had complained about the icicles and the cancellation early in the morning that I had heard about, and they went, even though it wasn't much warmer, they looked at the icicles, and there's a scandal on that story that I'll be getting to, if not this week, hopefully next week. And then they repaired the ship for an hour on a part of the ship that had to do with the temperature or readings that would indicate to the command post, I suppose, what the temperatures were, and that was broken, and how the fuel tank might burst and be dislodged, or seams would be ruptured, and the hydrogen would break through. And at that first week, there was not awareness that the rubber seals freeze in cold temperature and don't bend to accommodate covering over the area where the hydrogen gets out. There was worry about the chipping on the side of the ship done by repairmen from Lockheed, and also there was concern about icicles causing cracks in the seams. And I thought it was very important about the emphasis that the president would have on Star Wars and space, and now it seems that this Challenger being blown up the more I study, and it's 4 weeks later, is that they already knew it was going to blow up, that this would be, as I said on the broadcast, the run of the litter. They would unload it, and they already have a machinery out at Vandenberg ready to warm up the shuttle so they don't have any more problems. They already have a new booster rocker designed and developed so they don't have to worry about this. And this one had given them so many problems with inches of exploding in 1983, and they were able to solve it at that time. And I also emphasize how Ronald Reagan was using the teacher as really the only civilian while 6 military people were up there and hiding the purposes of the use of the NASA space shuttle as if it was for social and scientific reasons. The next week, on February the 10th, I emphasized the chronology, which was very important because now there are many, many articles, and I will be outlining them for you, on the disarray that the NASA organization was into, and I want to define NASA in a moment. But it was March 23rd, 1983, 3 years ago, when Reagan presented his Star Wars like a big production, like Cecil DeMille, here's my Star Wars. And it was at that time, in August of 83, that the Challenger was used and could monitor Larry McDonald when he went down, another Cold War strategy that gave Ronald Reagan every cent for every weapon he wanted from that moment on, and how then the Challenger and all the space shuttles were to be moved from commercial exploratory reasons to military uses, because in the month that I tried to explain this to you, you must be seeing more and more how the military is going to gain from all of this and how the military controlled the entire operation from beginning to end. And I cited the warfare of NASA, the various organizations in the Pentagon that were fighting with each other. And again, there's long stories about their failure and to get along with each other, the dislike of various people such as James Beggs, the NASA director, and who was moved out, and William Graham, the acting director, and the infighting in the White House, the policies, the Pentagon versus the Star Wars, and the involvement of Rockwell and Morton Thiokol of warning that it was dangerous, but if the shuttle still went down, they will make contracts along with Lockheed. And I was trying to illustrate the second week after it went down, the infighting in Washington, the infighting among NASA people, and the unloading of the James Watt Rainbow Coalition, the Japanese, the black, the Jew, and 2 women. I believe that the indications now are that is as sinister as your mind wants to believe, and that they even knew in advance that this thing was going to go down and waited till it was specifically cold. I couldn't figure out why, if it was warm on Sunday. It's a shock enough that they didn't go because it was Super Bowl Sunday, but they could have gone Monday afternoon or Tuesday afternoon. And I believe that the ICE team were right when they said that they only tested it, they didn't report it. The purpose is to test the cold to find out if it works, and now they know and don't have to use that booster anymore, that rocket, that the cold does affect the machinery, and they'll move to California where they have a warm setup ready to go where it won't be cold again. The Air Force, I cited, not only destroyed the most important piece of evidence they had within seconds, it was so quick the way they destroyed that booster, and then said, oh, that's our most important evidence, that they must have known, after it warmed up, just at the time of explosion, that it was just as it was going up. It actually took 70, a minute and 2 seconds or something for it to go up and be destroyed. But from the time that the fuel was let out, the ship was doomed, and now I believe it was doomed long before, months before, or even a year before, that something like this would be pulled, and they would set it, this one, for the January launch and wait till it was cold. And I have reason to believe that it is even more bad than we imagine. Also, after the second week, the accidental damage from the derrick, they didn't bother to x-ray the fuel tank. That was cited in Newsweek, and I want to go into that point in a moment, the importance of that, and also that the Air Force knew immediately the cause of explosion, and they've known it since mid-July and in August when there were reports, so they were going against all odds. If they did that, then they had to want it to go up, and they had no apologies. They said, we did the right thing, as if it were military orders, and I believe it was. And then on February 17th, the third week, of discussion of the shuttle Challenger, tape 741. I asked again, who made the decision against the NASA rules, against Morton Thiokol, to have this shuttle be launched in the cold? Of course, the answers were explained a little bit on public television on CNN this past week. I taped them, about 15 cassettes, 90 minutes each, and took the sound part, because my video wasn't down in L.A., to see the chain of command and how the system works, and came to the conclusion that the Nazis equal NASA, NASA equals, down in Huntsville, Alabama, were the people who spoke specifically to Mr. Lund and to put the pressure on him, and that the Marshall Space Center in Huntsville, Alabama, was the agency that pushed this, even though they knew the flaws and pretend the flaws weren't there. And of course, they continue to have the most to gain. If the thing doesn't work, it's not that important. And finally, last week, broadcast number 742, I was asking questions from various articles describing why the cover-up, such as forces go awry from accident chain, and then the intrusion of the word politics, that they tried to blame it on human errors, but finally the word politics got in the news, that Dan Rather said that the launch in cold weather was political decision, and also another article in the Washington Post, February the 9th, that it was political. By then, 3 weeks later, or almost a month later, the story about who asked it to launch was being circulated all about Washington, and the word political was getting into the media, and the various newspaper people were beginning to hear the truth about what happened. And the San Jose Mercury had a story. The testimony is so dramatic and unexpected that they agreed that President Reagan should be informed. And I believe if he knew and ordered them to fly, he knew what was going on all the time and was informed. Now they're seeking what they said was a white knight for the demoralized space station. They brought in Mr. Fletcher, who was the former space agency, who was the former director of NASA. He took time out to work with Ronald Reagan's committee to investigate Star Wars and missile defense of the United States, which in turn is the Star Wars. He's from Utah. He was president of the University of Utah, a scientist who is close to Morton Thiokol, to Orrin Hatch, to Jake Garn, the senators from Utah, and that is a state that gets $300 to $400 million a year from just the Morton Thiokol contracts with NASA anyway. And so they're bringing in Mr. Fletcher, and we'll do more on him, who is close to the very people who went against their own engineers and scientists. And he is like Earl Warren being brought in again to cover up the shuttle the Challenger. And Mr. Fletcher is an interesting character. There's a lot about him in the paper now. He is going to be their white knight. Donald Reagan, the chief of staff, had ordered him to take over the investigation, and he literally cried like Earl Warren with the Warren Commission, with LBJ telling him, you have to organize this and take care of the commission for us. So as the cover story evolves, that there were chains of errors and factors converged and design flaws and so forth, they're still covering up the story that people made decisions to go against the very machinery that they knew would not function under those circumstances, and therefore they didn't want it to function, and therefore you have to ask who gains and who loses. And as you read the articles on the financial pages and in between the lines, it becomes more clear every day to see who are the winners and losers. Now, the Monterey Herald had a story this morning, and I'm sure you people had, and it came over the wire service. It had to do with that TV show yesterday in the interview of Senator Hollings, and the title of the article is NASA was pressured. Senator Hollings suggests, and he's been saying this all week, Senator Ernest Hollings urged that the investigators determine whether NASA was pressured to launch because the presence of teacher Krista McAuliffe on the ill-fated flight put extra pressure on the agency to launch. I want to know, where is the pressure from? Is it from Congress? Of course not. Is it contract pressure? They said no. But there was contract pressure for Morton Thiokol. If they didn't launch, they wouldn't get a new contract that was up for renewal at the time. Is it White House pressure or is it Pentagon pressure? Well, it could be two, White House and Pentagon. We'll take a 1-minute break and go on to the pressure that is upon the committee now to find out who put the pressure to launch. And Senator Hollings is really pushing this. He's been pushing it all week. This is Mae Brussell, and it's part 2 of broadcast number 743, and it's March the 3rd, 1983. I hate to spend so much time in a quick hour doing a resume of the areas that I touched upon before, but they're very pertinent to the hundreds of articles that have come out in the past 3 to 4 weeks that are leaning to fit exactly into the synopsis that I gave you the first 4 weeks, and that's why it is so important. Now, to continue with this story and the ABC program of Mr. Senator Ernest Hollings, he said on the program this week with David Brinkley, he was asked about speculation. He was aware of speculation that pressure from the White House to launch the shuttle before Reagan's State of the Union address scheduled the evening of the launch was circulating all over Washington. It ought to be cleared up, and Hollings said that it had come to his attention that the message came from the White House to get it up in time for the State of the Union message. Who was in contact, Hollings asked, and I called his office in Washington today to give him some leads on who I think could have been or where to look for it, and again, I'll tell you in a few minutes. He said, you can't tell me the White House wasn't in contact with that particular launch. What was said? Who was called? When were they called? Because everyone in the Cape says, for the first time in the entire philosophy and process, everything was reversed. It was violated. Why that day was it violated? And then Larry Speaks was on TV this week in between the hearings saying it's the most vicious and distorted rumor he ever heard and blaming the press, and that's why Reagan was calling them sons of bitches. And Jesse Moore last week told the committee that NASA officials have not been under any political pressure, but he's told a dozen lies back to back in the last 2 weeks. This program operates on a launch-by-launch basis, and Jake Garn of Utah, Senator Jake Garn, said he didn't believe the pressure was a factor in the decision, although he agreed with the commission's conclusion that the launch decision process was flawed. Well, if it was flawed and they went against all the others, it had to be political because it wasn't scientific and it wasn't managerial. It has nothing to do with business contracts. In a sense, it wouldn't make good business to have your machinery blow up and tell them to go ahead when you've designed it in a way that it won't work under any of those circumstances. Garn also said on ABC, I think the evidence is overwhelming through 24 launches that NASA always had safety first. I was involved in that process on my own flight. 5 delays, 4 of them for safety of flight, and a lot of pressure there. But the point is that Senator Jake Garn may have known there was pressure to fly, but they still didn't fly. They opt for safe. So in this case, how much pressure comes, what kind of a safety valve is let down or loose, that in this case they flew against what the builders and the makers of these pieces of machinery said to do, and therefore when they go against the pressures and deny themselves the chance to wait until a little later in the afternoon. And so what was the pressure? Now, as I say, I called the office of Senator Hollings, and I suggested that there were several people that we know about, maybe more, that were, in quotes, traumatized by the events. LA Times, February 28th, has a story. Elmer Thomas is the first on-the-ground casualty of the Challenger disaster. He's an engineer with NASA. He collapsed of a heart attack right after the accident. He had a position in the launch viewing room. He died 2 days later. Now, I wrote an article on deaths right after Watergate, and there were 31 of them, and one of them was Beverly Kay, the secretary who worked for Rosemary Woods, who worked on those 18 minutes that were erased on the Richard Nixon tapes. And I wonder if, by any coincidence, Elmer Thomas was the person in the room who got the phone call, who relayed the message. It has to be some kind of a gopher or a very secure telephone to Mr. William Graham's But Elmer Thomas died right after that. And the very next day, a Lockheed employee was described as losing his mind and going crazy, and they had to take him away because he worked with the team, the crew, that had some kind of a damage on the external fuel tank where it was slightly scratched. And as I mentioned a few weeks ago, they hoped it was repaired, otherwise the oxygen could get in that hole. And the article in the LA Times says that it was apparently repaired. There wasn't a positive and apparently, but they said, well, it posed no threat to the safety of the shuttle. The worker reacted strongly. He said, this is it. It's my fault. I've killed 7 people. And he went out of his mind. Now, Lockheed has been a conduit for the CIA, for assassination teams, and I think of this spaceship, the shuttle Challenger, being similar to the political assassinations and the committees being compared to the Warren Commission in the sense that the story of exploration of space, to look at Halley's Comet or to look at Jupiter and so forth, the exploration and the business part of it, the managerial and the business contracts, was just a cover for Star Wars. And just as the Korean War in 1950 was an excuse for Nazis such as Nikolai Malaksa to come to California, the head of the Iron Guard, to come to Richard Nixon's law offices in Whittier, or for Otto von Bolschwing to come to this country, and many of the top Nazis, the excuse was the Cold War had escalated in South Korea. And I believe that since Ronald Reagan and Edward Teller presented the Star Wars in 1983, and I'll be developing this more and more, the infights and the changing of people in charge of NASA, key positions being changed throughout the whole network as of to this date of when the Challenger went off and afterwards, that it was a military kind of an operation that was done. And so if this was true, certain key people would go crazy, would die right on the spot, and I think it's very important to check that out. I also suggested to Senator Holling's secretary, I left a message for that the Rogers Committee is looking into the 27th and the 28th, the conference at night with Morton Thiokol, don't go, and also what happened when the Challenger blew up. But they're not going into the 25th, the 26th of January, because the 26th was the Super Bowl Sunday, and it was a clear day, and Krista McAuliffe was riding her bike, and Mr. Smith, or one of the officers, was riding, and they weren't doing anything on Sunday afternoon and could have gone off, and they had some mishaps on Monday that were so unimportant, where the screwdriver didn't work and the bolt didn't work, and it looked like they were just stalling, because I don't believe they didn't have the right equipment, so that on the 26th, which was Sunday, and 25th was Saturday, they waited because of dust storms in Africa. Well, if weather is a factor, if dust in Morocco is a factor, or dust or sand in Senegal, Africa, then they are also aware of climate changes in Florida. If climate or dust or sand affects the machine, so does cold. Cold on the tiles for reentry, cold along the seams that could tear if the fuel is frozen, solid fuel knocks aside, and cold on the seals that don't bend to hold in so that the hydrogen rather, doesn't pour out, which it did. So the key is why they didn't go up on the Saturday, if sand is no more problem than cold, I'm sure, to the machine, and they wouldn't have needed it anyway. And Sunday they had all day, afternoon and evening, and they had Monday afternoon, and they had Tuesday afternoon, and because they didn't use any of those, they opt for the coldest in the history of any space launch, and I believe they were testing the launch, and that's what happened. Now, Mr. William Rogers, was appointed by Ronald Reagan. This is commission to investigate the Space Shuttle Challenger's explosion, but he refers to, he has summaries of what NASA did, and he talks about the procedure for whether to launch, and NASA is a general word used by the various factors in the newspaper and the news media. But NASA isn't a homogeneous one organization with one mind. It's a group of people with different opinions fighting among each other and fighting to the point that could be fatal to testing machinery, to taking over the power, to pulling other people out of office to make way to get in. Just as Mr. Beggs was removed, he was the NASA director until December of '85, and then he was indicted for taking millions and millions of dollars from General Dynamics. The same day that he was indicted, the other General Dynamics people were let off for doing the same things. But William Graham then became the director of NASA, and he's from the Heritage Foundation, which works with Mr. Coor and Fritz Kramer and Henry Kissinger and Daniel Graham in the far right wing involved in High Frontier and Star Wars. And there's a bitter fight going on between them. I cited a little bit of it and give you more details this next week. So NASA is not one group. It's the 7 people that were victims of the tragedy are part of what are NASA policies that are general and which has factions fighting each other and threatening each other and offering huge millions of dollars of contracts if people will behave in a certain way. Now, NASA at Marshall Space Center in Huntsville, Alabama, I have fingered as being the culprits in this, a Mr. Lucas and Mr. Reinwaltz. I'll go into those later, the names, Reinertz rather, and the men at NASA at Marshall Space Center. That is NASA. That is the home of Project Paperclip, the Defense Department, of Wernher von Braun, of Mr. Rudolph, and the top Nazis that came to this country to prepare for World War III, for first strike, for mastery of the rockets. And this is the Star Wars weapons factory, NASA at Marshall Space Center, and they're the people that pressured the Utah firm to make their decision to launch as against the engineers who make the piece of machinery. Now, NASA also, the second NASA is at Cape Canaveral and the Kennedy Space Center, and that is where up to this time the shuttles were launching from, and when the weather is good, they come home through there or else through Edwards Air Force Base in California. That is the site for the takeoff, but the main brains and policies aren't made at Cape Canaveral or Kennedy Space Center. They're made with some retired and some not retired Nazis from Huntsville working with our Americans, but well-trained at losing lives and working with slave labor over in Punamund and Dora, and being able to test things like the rings, whether they will hold up in cold weather or not, knowing they won't, or shifting the power from the alleged exploratory again to the Star Wars. There's the NASA in Huntsville and there's the NASA in Florida, combined the Kennedy Center and then there's another NASA, and that's the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. That has to do with a lot of the politics and the brains and the command center. When the Apollo program is going to the space shuttle, the computers work and the boardroom is there, and that's where the Johnson Space Center is important for who's the head of the entire NASA organization, the politics of Houston, Texas, the Defense Department, and the CIA. That's down there in Houston, the command center. Then, in this particular case, there were the NASA people at Utah under Morton Thiokol, where we have Mr. Fletcher, part of citizenry of the state of Utah, an active person, former president of the University of Utah, working closely with Senator Garn and Senator Hatch, two of our most conservative gung-ho, make the weapons and ask later senators from Utah. So the Utah Center was important in this decision, and also Rockwell International in Downey, California, where they make the main carriage and where it is manufactured and where they know icicles can fall back and crack the size of the machine. They're discounting that now, but they were heavy into that before. So NASA depends on the team in Alabama, in California, in Texas, Utah, and Florida. There are many other branches of places where they contract, but these are the communication places, the places where they would work together in case of danger and should be working together in questions of circumstances questionable of whether they should take off or go. And if the orders come to Huntsville or to any one of the group and it's passed along as a military command, then I'm sure it spreads on down the line to the others that they're going to go. At the time of the accident, NASA, all 5, was completely in disarray, and I'll detail some more for you on that. But the big change in NASA, and I want to emphasize again, I had that early when the Challenger went down, the big shift was in March of 1983 to take away the behavior of the space program as being civilian and placing it with people militarily, and after one explosion, such as the Challenger, which was the runt of the litter, always had problems, was always broken, was identified as a spy ship when Larry McDonald went down, launched at midnight and was over the Soviet Union during that episode. This was the runt, and this is the one they could unload the Rainbow group with. And now the stories are that the next 3 shuttles going up will be all military, and as I said before, the military then will have priority. Now, William Rogers has been accused of covering up already by Senator Hollings and others. And there was a story in the LA Times, and it pretty well does his cover story for what he's going to report. He said the procedure for deciding whether to launch the Challenger was clearly flawed. The procedure was flawed. No, the procedure wasn't flawed. I have to take issue with him again. The people understood perfectly what was happening, and they forced the persons over the engineers at Rockwell and Morton Thiokol that you have to change your mind. These were top-level launching decisions, and those people, according to the cover story of the committee now, is that they were unaware of warnings of cold. I don't believe those top people, those top 5, were unaware of anything like that because they talked about cold as a danger on Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. So they went with the lowest temperature. The fact that NASA refused to accept the Thiokol engineers is because they had to get orders from high up, again, militarily, from the Defense Department and the President of the United States. And when the shuttle exploded, the engineers gave the reasons why it exploded and how they knew in 1984, in July 84, and 1985 in August, the details of how it would happen. There no longer was any reason to believe that all of NASA, who makes these decisions, doesn't know or they shouldn't be there. Now, the LA Times quotes again Mr. William Rogers saying, in quote, warnings on shuttle safety were not fully understood or acted upon or brought to the attention of top officials who decided to launch the Challenger. Those are absolute lies. They did not fully understand. They understood perfectly well the difference between 8 and 9 degrees and 50 degrees or 30 degrees. They acted upon them by understanding. This is the cover story. They acted upon them, and this information was brought to the attention of the top officials. There is no way that they couldn't know the dangers because they were checking the ice early in the morning. They'd have to know the dangers on the seals. Now, there are many large articles that, when I say large articles, I don't mean columns. I mean the full page of a newspaper. You must be seeing them in your papers, those of you that listen or subscribe to World Watchers. I'm just going to cite the titles of about 10 of them and then share those with you next week. But just to get the tone of where I'm leading and what all this massive news is about. One, the Los Angeles Times has a huge story. NASA officials deny that the firm was pressured to launch. And this has to do with those hearings, the influence of NASA on Morton Thiokol. They did force him to launch, and the engineers said, we won't go along with this. We'd hate to be the ones if something happened. Another large newspaper article, launch expert opposed liftoff to the very end. And he stayed out, the Rockwell expert, Rocco Petroni, stayed out of the decision to go, just as Mr. McDonald and others at Morton Thiokol said, and he said he would never go along with the decision to launch. Another story in the LA Herald, networks should air the shuttle hearings, and it tells about the high drama of the moment in those CNN hearings. Were plenty high drama and very interesting, and they cite how when the shuttle went down, it was photographed over and over again, and not one single major network shows those hearings or shows these people so you can identify them. Another long story, long-term severe cost of subtle loss emerging. And this says the space program will be severely handicapped for years to come. National security requirements come first. They must place military payloads in orbits, or they can't be usurped. For the remaining 3 shuttles for the next 5 years, the United States must put the remaining 3 of military, and then it says in quotes, the needs of the Defense Department are not flexible. Commercial and scientific launchings will be slashed. That is a whole page article, 2 pages actually, but they say the military isn't flexible, and this is one reason I think the military wanted to use those 3 and every one afterwards, and therefore they could blow up the one with the civilian teacher and the rainbow astronauts on it. Another long story in the LA Times. NASA's flaws extend beyond its launches. Serious discord at top level. Then another top headline on the next page. NASA, seeds of the agency's woes have been germinating for years. Now, since World War II, NASA has developed the space program for an offensive, a first strike offensive for World War III. And this article goes on about the fights that were germinating. And as I say, since Reagan's presenting his Star Wars proposal in March of '83, the problems and the fights have been festering. And this article goes into the infighting of the teams, the very top teams. And as I say, broadcast 740, I talked about the Star Wars versus the State Department and Pentagon, the fighting at the top, and the influence it was having on the agency. Another long article, NASA official denies he knew of engineer descent. That's George Hardy, who's keeping away from the other top officials, and said, I didn't know anything about it. And then there had been a whole series of articles putting down NASA, which is the purpose now to build up the military uses. And Wall Street Journal has a long story. NASA, once a master of publicity, fumbles in handling the shuttle crisis. And it goes on to say it's amazing that they were so ill-prepared for anything. They only thought wonderful things would happen. Well, Mr. Beggs was removed shortly before. Mr. Graham had no technology on the space programs to begin with. Jesse Moore was just new into position. And there was a shifting of people in Houston and all around to put what appeared like ignorant people there, not knowledgeable, as the chain of command broke down. The LA Herald has a long editorial behind the shuttle tragedy. NASA needs to clean up its act. Now it is really being destroyed. Haynes Johnson, Washington Post, February the 12th. NASA's decaying public image in the replacement of William Graham, who wasn't well known to the public or inside NASA. He didn't have space background. William Graham is being promoted after the shuttle was blown up to Houston, Texas for a bigger job, but he was fumbling at this time and playing dumb. They all are a bunch of piano players at the whorehouse who didn't know anything is going on upstairs. Another long section of articles based upon the hearings. Top NASA officials unaware of talk to delay launch. You can't be up all night fighting the weather problem, such as Alan McDonald was describing, and not be told, and those who knew didn't pass it on to the others. That is a big cover story. We don't know what's happening. And then, of course, the New York Times has a long story, February 13th. NASA set aside a fail-safe rule for the booster seal. They didn't have a second backup ring, and as I say, as I read these articles, and there's a mountain of them to read, it seems that they wanted this one to go. There was no second guessing on this, nothing to protect it if one seal didn't hold. This was to end, for all purposes, what you've seen of NASA up till the present time and get ready for the next stage. Now, out of the Huntsville area are people from the Project Paperclip operation. Wall Street Journal, February 26, has a story. History shows rocketry has been a hard and unforgiving science. And there's quotations of Conrad Dannenberg, one of Wernher von Braun's scientists from Project Paperclip. They identify him as a paperclip scientist, and how they saw many friends killed in experiments, that's what rocketry is, and many were strapped to solid fuel boosters with gliders and on snow sleds. And the gist of the article is, in the process of developing space weaponry or space stations, lots of people die. So what? And they quote Conrad Dannenberg from Paperclip. Then another George von Tiesenhausen, also from Paperclip, and he says these mishaps were inevitable, and he describes how the liquid fuel on the V-2 rocket posed a problem, and how they were always under tremendous pressure in Punaman, that they were experimenting and having many deaths. And what I really believe, as I say, is that the Challenger was an experiment. The ice team said we went out and checked the ice, and it was down, 7 to 8 degrees, but they didn't report it because it was only to be used for future test cases. They didn't use it to stop the flight. It was to be used later to test. This is similar to the Japanese in Manchuria freezing American GIs and prisoners and shooting in their legs to see if it goes through the ice, or Joseph Mengele and the top Nazis doing tests in Germany and freezing people and throwing them in frozen water. The tests have been done in Germany, in Nazi Germany, on various prisoners by various scientists, many scientists and doctors. And now these people from Project Paperclip surface again after this tragedy, as much as to say, well, so what? We've gone through a lot of this before. Then there's a quotation. Wernher von Braun was very much against NASA's decision to use solid rockers for manned flight. We felt that using an essentially uncontrollable rocket was a radical step that would compromise the safety of the shuttle. NASA decided to use them. Shuttle, the cabin there is 15 stories high, 170,000 pounds of solid boosters, the largest, most complex ever built. And the Wall Street Journal goes on to say this is a whole new ball game when you're talking about temperature stresses of supersonic space travel. We have no experience in this, and a single malfunctioning can cause the collapse of the entire system. That's referred to as the tent pole failure. And we've had plenty of those when we're camping. When that center pole goes, it all goes down. And they said the Challenger disaster and the possibility of freezing weather could cause gases to leak past the rubber gaskets that shield the shuttle's right solid rocket booster. So that the scientists for Paperclip are saying that von Braun said, don't go with this. We went with it. We used it on a ship that almost blew up earlier in 1983 within inches of blowing up. The seals had been burned. They knew they would burn in the cold. And now these people are coming out of the woodwork and saying von Braun didn't want it anyway. And out in Vandenberg Air Force Base in California, there will be a heater to heat up where you don't have the ice. They already have a new kind of a booster ready to go where you won't have this problem. And visually having it explode right there, waiting until it's cold, because Florida is usually warm. So instead of going Saturday, Sunday, Monday morning, Monday afternoon, Tuesday afternoon, they went in the cold, and who knows if a little nick on the side by the Lockheed people, the super agents of spies and intelligence, didn't help it along because the thing exploded and the emphasis is on the seal. And the poor fellow that was out there working went out of his mind and said he had killed these people. And the New York Times has some quotations in there about this event, and they compare it at the present time to the artichoke. Remember the Operation Artichoke, the mind control program of the MK-Ultra. And this person from NASA said, the investigation of what's going on now is like an artichoke. One serious NASA official said, every day they peel something else. The commission has begun pointing the finger at the individuals and the procedures involved in the catastrophe, and the resulting picture isn't pretty. The White House has been surprised by some of the disclosures before the Rogers Commission, particularly the defect of the O-ring seals and the intense arguments after Morton Thiokol engineers warned NASA not to launch the Challenger in cold weather. They've been informing the White House, of course, about those problems. The L.A. Herald has a short story that was picked up also in the L.A. Times. Political battle coming up. Senator Reagan and other congressional critics are troubled by the Presidential Commission's inevitable ties to the White House and by their penchant for meeting in private. This forced members of Congress to rely on news media, not on testimony, for most of their information. Now, Reagan campaigned for the teacher in space. Reagan and NASA set up a program for children and school children to watch it. Why would the White House cover up the investigation of how the teacher was killed unless they were going to talk about her that evening and had pushed the investigation? Because they had an interest in the children and in their teacher to want to know how this happened. And the president is interfering with the process. When members of the Senate Commerce Committee wanted to hear the Rogers Committee testimony and witnesses, they said, no, we represent the president. This is the president's commission, and you can't come in. This is executive. This commission is for him so that he knows, and you can't hear what these people are saying. So if he appointed this commission, and he also set up the teacher as somebody that he was going to use for his very important State of the Union message, you'd think that he would want to get to the very bottom of this instead of covering it. But he is covering it, so he must have had some part in the total disaster of launching it. Rogers' excuse, as I say, is that he works for the president and the legislative shouldn't interfere in a national tragedy of this kind. And that's an article from a short article from the L.A. Times. And then there was a much larger article in the Los Angeles Herald and Examiner. President Democrats ask independent subtle probe, and many of you may have heard this. I don't think it went over the wire services. It was on the LA Times, and this goes into the fact that Senator Hollings is accusing this committee of covering up, and now it's become, from the place that I reviewed for you where Dan Rather said it was political, and 2 weeks ago it was a political decision to launch, the Democrats are asking for an independent congressional examination of the matter. And Senator Hollings has said that the stakes are high if the controversy grows and the conclusions are clouded by the kind of uncertainty that plagued the Warren Commission's findings on the assassination of John Kennedy. The consequences will be damaging for the nation's space program. And I will continue next week with where I left off. I hope I can continue there with the political arguments of Democrats versus Republicans and the charges that William Rogers, handpicked by Ronald Reagan, is covering up the truth about this Challenger disaster. In the meanwhile, this is Mae Brussell. You take care. Thank you again for the many books and articles, and I'll be back with you next week.